Good morning and good afternoon. My name is John Herbst and I run the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. We have a wonderful event for you today, a wonderful virtual event on the Russian-Saudi oil war. Will oil prices drop to $15 a barrel or lower? We have a distinguished panel with me today. We have Anders Ostlund, who's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center. We have Randy Bell, who's director of the Global Energy Center at the Atlantic Council. And we have Kirsten Fontenrose, who's the director of the Middle East Security Initiative at the Atlantic Council. So we'll get started right away. And the first question will be to Randy. Randy, could you describe what the oil market was like 2 weeks ago before Moscow's decision to discontinue cooperation with OPEC?
Yep, thanks, John, and thank you all for joining us this morning. I'm glad that we're able to keep these convenings going virtually while we're all working remotely these days. So the oil market, I'm going to take a little bit further step back and go back to the beginning of the year, where the oil market had its high of just shy of $70 on Brent during the day of and right after the killing of Soleimani. And it's worth noting that it really did not even break $70 at that point, suggesting that there already was a lot of oil in the market. Now, as the market started declining from there, you saw that there were conversations later in January starting to worry about coronavirus impacting demand. But that was, at least at the time, seen perhaps just as a Chinese aviation story. Now, China is the world's the largest oil importer, so that would have an impact on demand. But it wasn't seen as at that point a crisis. Though I think to point to where we were going, towards the end of January, Libya production got taken offline, and that was it's been over 1 million barrels a day offline from Libya. In January, that barely moved the market. So we've seen decline since then. So if you go back to 2 weeks ago, right at the beginning of March, before the fateful OPEC Plus meeting, oil was right around $50. You were starting to see the demand decline from coronavirus, but you hadn't seen yet the level of lockdown that we're now seeing in Europe, that we're now starting to see in the United States and other parts of the world at that point at the beginning of March. Now, the markets were anticipating that OPEC and OPEC Plus would reach a deal and that they would take additional production offline. Obviously, that didn't happen, and price has since cratered. And it went down pretty dramatically as Brent is now below $30 today. What's hard to disentangle is what the oil price war is doing versus what the demand destruction is doing. And what we're seeing now is demand destruction, at least in the short term, of 10 million barrels a day or more are some of the projections for April. That's 10% or more of the global market. So regardless of the oil price war, there would be way too much oil on the market. And I think it's also worth putting into context that February was the single largest month for U.S. net exports. So we've got a lot of oil coming from the U.S. We've got plenty of oil coming from the OPEC and OPEC Plus countries, and soon Saudi will be flooding the market. Plus this demand decline. The big question in my mind going forward is, when do we run out of storage? And that, I think, will actually shape the market more than perhaps anything else that's going on right now.
Randy, thank you. The immediate cause for the drop in oil, of course, was the Russian decision not to cooperate further with OPEC. Anders, why do you think that the Kremlin took this decision?
Well, I think that the person who really decides these matters is Igor Sechin, the CEO of Rosneft, that is producing roughly half of Russia's oil, a bit more than 5 million barrels a day. And Sechin was Putin's assistant in St. Petersburg in the early 90s. And his outstanding quality is that he's absolutely obedient to Putin. The big problem is that he's absolutely ruthless. and he only thinks of his own narrow interest, and Putin allows that to happen. Rosneft does not get more revenue from a higher oil price because the Russian oil tax system is organized like that. But virtually all income from a higher oil price goes to the treasury. And for some reason, Sechin was allowed to overrule other Russian interests. So we can see that the Minister of Finance has got weaker. Alexander Novak, the Minister of Energy, who actually pursues the negotiations in OPEC, I would just call him a good civil servant. He does his job. He's a diplomat rather than a decision maker. So now Sechin has been taking over, and he is absolutely ruthless. I think that his main concern is that he's severely sanctioned by the United States. And it's in several ways. First, in July 2014, he was sanctioned by the US because of the Russian military aggression in eastern Ukraine. And he complained that he could no longer go by motorbike together with his good friend Rex Tillerson in the United States, as they had agreed to do. And Rosneft got a severe restriction on technology and also on its financing. And the US has followed up, while it didn't directly concern Rosneft, with sanctioning of Nord Stream 2, which had hit Gazprom in December last year. But now in February, the US sanctioned Rosneft's trading company because of its dealings with Venezuela. So I think that Sechin said the US will have it and just hit out. Sechin is not a very nice figure. So they say that he deals with his four top deputies who are foreigners as if they are servants, while his lower deputies who are Russians, he treats like Serbs. So this is the kind of a person Sechin is. It's all about him and nothing about the Russian national interest. And he has full protection from Putin.
That's fascinating, Anders. Okay, Kirsten, it takes two to have a fight. So the Russians take this first decision. Why do you think the Saudis chose to increase production in response? Kirsten, are you there? Oh,
there we go. How's that?
Excellent.
Sorry, the unmute button was fritzing. Let me start again. I think there are two reasons for this decision on the part of the Saudis, and both are political. One with regard to the relationship with the US, and one obviously with regard to the relationship with Russia. In the US, we've seen a series of phone calls between Saudi and US elites in the past week. The president and Secretary Pompeo are not happy with the Saudis, as we all are familiar, but there have not been any ultimatums given yet. The Saudis understand that they owe the US a little bit of a gratitude of debt. President Trump stood by them when the rest of the world considered them somewhat a pariah after a series of bad decisions in the past several years related to things like Jamal Khashoggi, the war in Yemen, harassing of the Canadians, kidnapping of Hariri. And without that sort of U.S. steadfast partnership, they might have found themselves far more sidelined in the world economy. So they understand that they need to tread lightly there. They also can't afford to anger the president when the specter of NOPEC still looms. Angering the president could trigger his support for the idea of dismantling OPEC, which we're already hearing rumors of at Department of Energy for cartel-related reasons. In addition, in terms of the U.S. relationship, keeping oil prices low and countering Russia right now are both bipartisan issues. So the U.S. and Saudi are eager to kind of make friends and stay friends. The U.S. is happy to see this wedge between Saudi and Russia. We had not been pleased with the Russia-Saudi relationship prior, and the Saudis had told us, well, this is a relationship that can be leveraged for both of our gains. but we actually haven't seen that bear out. In Syria, we didn't see Saudi leverage over Iran, for instance, and Russia in terms of relationship with the Assad regime. We also haven't seen the Saudis able to leverage their influence over Russia with relation to Yemen, when we asked them to convince the Russians to stop vetoing UN sanctions, UN resolutions in the Security Council that would have prevented Iran from passing weapons to the Houthis. When they weren't able to do that, we said, okay, well, maybe this relationship is not something we can leverage. We wouldn't like to see it quite so strong. One thing we need to remember is that Putin is setting himself up to be ruler for life. And we also obviously have the same situation in autocratic regimes like that in Saudi. So they will come back together. What the US needs to do here is make sure that their interests are protected in that situation. And one way that's being a little bit precarious right now is because the other situation that is bipartisan is the desire to punish Saudi right now due to these oil production increases and due to what we saw from them in Yemen. So it's now not just Democrats calling for legislative punishment for their actions in Yemen. It's now bipartisan, shale-producing states, senators from there, including Senator Cruz, for instance, saying, this is going to cost me my seat. This is costing jobs in my state. We've got to do something to twist Saudi's arm here. The Department of Energy wants to work with Saudi. They're looking at a way to preserve Saudi's leadership role among oil-producing nations and still omit the cartel piece that so angers this administration. And I'm sure others can talk to that, or we can get to that in the Q&A. Let me move on really quickly to the way that Saudi looks at the relationship with Russia. They do need to demonstrate that they do have leverage. As I mentioned, it's been proven that they don't in some of the other scenarios. And this is one of the few ways that they can outgame Russia. And it is a way for them to show Russia that there is needed in the relationship and that they aren't just a mat that Russia can walk on. And we do believe that Saudi is going to maintain this production cut until Russia agrees to come back to the OPEC plus table. The U.S. needs to be careful not to drive Saudi closer to Russia, and Saudi needs to be careful not to disemploy the constituencies of Republican senators and drive themselves outside the good graces of the U.S. I'll leave it there for now.
Okay, what strikes me about your responses, you're describing Saudi motivation principally in geopolitical terms as opposed to economic terms. You don't think that they've done this at all to maintain their market share and prevent Russia from getting an edge?
Absolutely, but I think that's at the root of that is a geopolitical game. You know, they're not benefiting from this economically. This isn't necessarily a sound economic decision for them, and we can let the energy experts really speak to that. But from watching the way Saudi and Russia react to one another over years, the geopolitics are always at the base of it. Remember, there's a larger strategy that MBS has in terms of regime survivability and their place as a primary actor on the world stage, even outside the energy sector. And this is critical. This little one-upsmanship is important.
All right, thank you. Randy, you already talked about the importance of COVID-19 driving oil prices down. So first question, what is your sense of the impact of the changes in the oil market on producers?
Right. Well, it depends on where you are in the world. Of course, the Saudis can produce, and they say 13 million barrels a day. They will still be profitable because their cost of production is under $5 a barrel. Now, the question is what they will do, what that does to their budget. Now, Saudi revenue actually will be roughly the same, less, but it won't be impacted as much as in Russia because for a couple of reasons. Saudi has a lot more room to grow their production. And so while they'll be making less per barrel, they'll have more volume. So they will have more revenue. So the Russians don't have nearly as much room to grow their production. I've read something like 500,000 barrels, maybe. Anders, you might know better than I on that. What does it do for U.S. producers? Well, you'll probably start to see new shale developments will be put on hold. It's probably not economical to drill new wells, but the wells that have been drilled because of hedging will continue to produce. So we won't see these impacts for a couple of months in the U.S. I think that there's the conversation is focused on this the three, Russia, Saudi, and the U.S. But I think there's a whole range of other producers that are actually going to be impacted much more dramatically. Both Saudi and Russia have big cash reserves. Oil is not actually that much of a part of the overall U.S. economy. It will hurt these acutely in oil-producing areas. And I want to come back to that with regard to calculus. But you see places like Iraq, Nigeria, Libya has already had their production cut off, and they're having huge impacts if they're not able to put their production back online this year. So they're going to be destabilizing impacts in a lot of these oil-producing countries that are less well off and less politically stable than Russia, Saudi, and the U.S. For all of the discussion about Russia and Saudi and the political challenges they face, that's they're still in much better shape than Iraq. So I think that we really want to be looking out for what the destabilizing effects are of some of these smaller, less politically stable producers. I want to come back to something that Kirsten said, because I think there is, she's right that you see folks like Senator Cruz recognizing that they need to say something and try to act to bring oil prices back up for economic and political reasons within their district. But I think it's also worth noting that there were 13 senators that wrote to the Saudi ambassador. So it's a very small minority of districts, of states and of congressional districts that are actually impacted by this price crash. And for the majority of folks on the Hill, the low gasoline prices is perhaps the only silver lining for their constituents. Even though they're not driving very much because most people are on lockdown, it does help for the little driving that is happening for much of the country. And so I do think that you probably will see some action at some point, but it's not going to happen in the middle of this crisis. I think the other reason why it probably won't happen in the middle of this crisis, at least from the Hill, is that they're just too busy trying to deal with the stimulus. And if you saw what happened trying to get the Senate to pass the stimulus bill and the amount of negotiations, and then they'll all go away, and then there'll probably need to be another stimulus. There may be some energy included in a fourth tranche of stimulus, but it's worth noting that there was no energy included in the third tranche, even though the Sunday night version of the Senate text had $3 billion for the SPR. There was a huge amount of talk on the Democratic side about clean energy mandates, clean energy support, trying to get that in the stimulus. At the very least, some requirements on the aviation industry to decarbonize the sector. None of that made it in the bill. And so it's just not a priority for a lot of people right now, where if you look at the unemployment numbers that came out today, really it's saving those small businesses across this range of districts that I think is going to be the top priority for the Hill. So if there's action in the short term, it's probably got to come from the administration itself.
Randy, thank you. Anders, two major Russian propaganda themes or analytical themes are that their desire to to maintain oil production was a shot at the United States in general, and at shale producers in particular. Would you say this is their real motivation, or is this just a justification for, as they explain, their cratering revenues or oil revenues as a result of this?
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting to hear Kirsten discussing Saudi Arabia, and it's a very clear asymmetry of the Russian and Saudi interests. The Russians are looking upon the U.S. As the propaganda says, and it looks upon the U.S. in two ways. I emphasize the sanctions. Of course, to beat U.S. Shale oil is also a major consideration. The Russians are not much into it, and they think that the Americans are easy to beat here. There are many people who think that they exaggerate their strength. And then on the economic side, what Randy talked about, the Russians are not very afraid of the lost income. And I think somewhat improperly so, because the Russians, since December 2014, have a floating exchange rate. And that means that the budget is close to balance and the current account is always in overbalance, almost regardless of the oil price. But this, I think, is a serious mistake, because what happens to Russia is that they lose a lot in imports. They get much less for their oil. And I looked up on the numbers. So the difference between 2016 and 2011 in terms of import revenues is no less than $240 billion. And this is what Russia loses in import revenues. And if we go now from 2019 to 2020, probably Russia will lose $140 billion in export revenues. And this is 1/3 of our export revenues. So what we should expect is a big fall in GDP. Now you would say that, of course, with the coronavirus, we will see this fall in the GDP everywhere in any case, but it will be reinforced by this fall in the oil price. But the Russians don't think about it. Yesterday, Putin made a big address to the Russian nation about the coronavirus crisis. And he says that because of the global crisis, the global economy will decline and we can't escape it. So in his ordinary fashion, he blames the world economy for Russia underperforming economically. It's not our fault. And therefore, Putin doesn't feel that he needs to do anything about the oil price. It's sort of throwing the kitchen sink in. We are hitting the Americans now. Well, Saudi Arabia, thinking of what Kirsten said, is really sort of an afterthought and not central to the Russian argument. I should add something, and that is that Sechin's major interest is to get control over the whole Russian oil industry. And this makes it easier for him to take over the number 2 oil company today, Lukoil, which is still private, and that is not sufficiently well connected with the Kremlin. So Sechin has taken over the first Yukos, then TNK-BP, then Bashneft, and the talk in Moscow is, who is next? And the common answer is Lukoil. It could be some minor oil company, but this is where Sechin is going. So why not continue?
Anders, thank you very much. Kirsten, again, coming back to your analysis of Saudi motivation, some people in the media have been written that Saudis too are trying to, with their decision, send a real blow to to American shale producers. Randy referred to the letter coming from 13 senators, coming from those parts of the country where shale is produced. Do you think that part of Saudi motivation is, in fact, to limit shale production in the United States?
I think it's a secondary motivation, though. I mean, you know, when Saudi makes a decision like this, there's so many pieces at play. Their ministers don't make independent decisions, and it's always a part of a bigger picture. So at the same time that they're talking about punishing our shale industry to some extent, they're also entering our gas industry, you know, with the deal they may be signing with Sempra, for instance. So they're still looking to prop up American energy industry in some fashion and assist it with growth. So I would think that they would not be looking at that as their primary play here. And to get back to the conversation on the Hill, to Randy's point, I think it's going to be really interesting to watch, because those 13 senators are from, you know, predominantly Republican powerful states. And those are many states that have stood by the president when he has prevented legislation from passing that would be anti-Saudi in flavor, limiting Patriot missiles, limiting sales of F-35s or F-16 parts and maintenance, this sort of thing. And so if they do feel like there's a need to slap Saudi on the hand, we could see some of that. We could see things like NOPEC come back around. We could see legislation passed that prevents them from even entering the energy industry or entering gas. We've got the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. at Treasury that passed that legislation. When was it? January 2018, I think. that includes the energy sector that could block Saudi from even entering. So I think that's something to watch.
Okay. MBS is clearly the main decision maker in Riyadh, but are there others who played an important role on their recent decision in oil generally?
There are several folks who play important roles, but they're all as advisors on different pieces. You have a national security advisor, Mossad Ali Ban, who's very well trusted. The defense minister, the minister of defense, minister of state for defense, his younger brother KBS, Khalid bin Salman, is an incredibly important advisor and a very sane person. Pretty good. Both of those guys can be trusted to really think about things, and they will consider the relationship with the U.S. and with Russia to the same extent that they will consider what the economic impacts are. You'll have, of course, the new oil minister and Al-Fallah, who's now Minister of Investment, will all be a part of that conversation as well. But MBS has really big fish to fry. He's very concerned about his own survivability in the face of COVID and in the face of palace intrigue that he believes exists, whether it does or not. We could even see something where he uses the offer of production cuts in exchange for U.S. backing when he chooses to make the move to actually take the throne. It will definitely be something to watch.
Thank you. Randy, the sharp drop in oil prices, a plus or a minus overall for the U.S. economy?
So as a net exporter, it will be an overall, it will hurt the U.S. economy as a net exporter, but that hurt will be felt very acutely geographically in these states that Kirsten has been talking about. And so at least in the short to medium term, you'll see parts of the country that are not producing oil and gas actually benefiting from these low oil prices. And so it's a question of what happens post June, July, as we start to feel these impacts on the oil sector, what that drags down to the overall U.S. economy. But the U.S. is a net exporter, but it's relatively new. We're not used to depending on it. So frankly, from a political perspective, I see that being harder a harder case to make, that we need to defend this sector. And you've already seen with the Democrats that they're not interested in defending the oil and gas sector. Schumer said when they blocked the SPR purchase from the bill that they weren't going to bail out big oil. So while yes, hurt the overall U.S. economy, a small amount, felt very acutely in a few places, but the average U.S. consumer will feel better because the price of the pump.
Okay. China, of course, is the world's great oil importer. So the impact of oil prices on Chinese economy.
Oh, I mean, the irony of all of this is that the Chinese will ultimately benefit from these low oil prices, and you see the Saudis making great deals on the oil that they're selling to China, and what is a good thing about that is it might help accelerate the recovery of the Chinese economy. So from a global economic perspective, as the Chinese start to turn their economy back on, cheap oil will make it that much easier for them to do so. Okay.
Randy, you said before that I think you're the one being pointed, and Anders and Kirsten, I think, were nodding, that this oil war will be resolved as Russia and OPEC, or Russia and Saudi Arabia, reach a new deal. When do you think this might happen?
Well, there's two drivers. One is the next scheduled OPEC meeting, which is in June. That seems like it's the most likely opportunity for a new deal. The other question that is on my mind, and we will see, and I hope that everyone tunes in to hear what Fatih Birol has to say about this for our event at noon. But when storage starts to become a problem, when they simply can't produce any more oil because there's no place to put it and there's not enough demand. When that happens, and I don't have a good sense of when that will be, but you're already starting to hear concerns about this, then I think that also might force people back to the table. But I also think that there's got to be a way for both Saudi and Russia to save face in this and both come out looking like they've won something. And so that makes it that much harder, that much harder for a deal to be struck before that OPEC meeting.
Anders, you gave great insight into the internal machinations which led to the Kremlin decision. In light of that, do you think Moscow will be willing to make a deal, recognizing that the economic impact of this has not been good for the country?
Yes, I think that at a certain stage, the Kremlin will realize that while they can manage the macroeconomic balances, both foreign balance and their own budget, they can not accept so much decline in output. So my sense is that this will take half a year until they realize it, and that it will not be easy. And the mechanism then will be quite easy. It will be Vladimir Putin who tells Igor Sechin that enough is enough. He has done so on other occasions. So that normally takes some time, but Putin does it when he thinks that it's really necessary, while he's surprisingly content with it. We did already see about a week ago that Putin's press spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, said that the fall in the oil price had been too big. So this suggested that something is happening. Peskov's statements should not be taken very seriously, but they might be seen as trial balloons. Putin has two foreign policy spokesmen, Peskov, when it's a question of saying something that is not true, and Yuri Ushakov when it's something that is true. So therefore, Ushakov speaks much more seldom than Peskov. As we speak, the G20 meeting between the leaders is taking place. And I noticed the Kremlin is amazingly transparent in these matters, that Putin appeared there with only the Minister of Finance, Anton Siluanov, and the Sherpa, the G20 Sherpa. No person represented oil interest, neither Novak nor Sechin. And Russia had said before that we are not going to discuss oil at this G20 meeting. So clearly Russia is holding on. Yes, and yesterday when Putin spoke about the terrible economic situation, he did not mention oil or oil price or exports in any fashion whatsoever. It was all about the problem of the coronavirus and the global economy contracting.
Okay, Anders, thank you. Kirsten, over to you. You also expressed, I say, confidence that the Saudis have more, can outweather the Russians in this fight. Any further elucidation on this?
Can you repeat that? I'm sorry, I didn't hear it.
You already made clear you thought the Saudis, in a sense, had a whip hand over the Russians in this oil fight. What are the principal reasons for that?
I think it's because the Saudis can just afford to go lower. You know, they can't afford to support Vision 2030 with prices this low, but they can keep production going with prices this low. And because their prices can be this low for production, they don't risk running into our dumping laws. I think Russia has a little more to risk there in terms of its budget and repercussions here.
Okay, thank you. I think I've dominated this conversation enough. We'll now turn to audience questions. We have a question from Eric Polowski. Does the U.S. government have an agreed position on pressure on the Saudis? While most of the interagency agrees that Saudis must de-escalate the price war, it seems that the president prefers to benefit from low gas prices and solve the unhappiness of energy companies through other means, or not at all. Is that an accurate assessment? Kirsten, I'll give that question to you.
Kirsten, you're muted.
There we go. Thanks. What I heard from interagency folks yesterday is that President Trump is happy that the price is low on the one hand, to Randy's point about, many of the states benefiting from this and his base certainly benefiting from this, but he's aware that the U.S. Shale sector is in a tailspin. And he's focused on COVID-19 survival right now. So he still hasn't given the Saudis a hard ultimatum on what he would like them to do or threatened anything if they do not cut production, for instance.
Okay, thank you.
John, can I jump in on that? Just one additional comment, which is that all the conversations that I've had with various folks in the administration suggest that they're still searching for what the policy will be, and that they're circling around a number of different ideas, but not really sure what it is yet. And I think that goes back to Kirsten's point that it's a second order issue, that really resolving the immediate economic crisis and the virus are the top two priorities. They know they need to deal with it, but they're not 100% sure how. So they're trying to figure out what that means.
Okay. We have a question from Mark Katz for Anders. The Russians argue that their budget can remain positive with a lower oil price than Saudi Arabia's. I wonder whether the Saudi strategy is to take advantage of their lower production costs to sell at a price lower than Russian production costs. Each then sees itself as having an advantage over the other. Who actually does?
Yeah, I think that I agree with the general grain of this discussion that the Saudis have more leeway than the Russians have. But the Russian situation is quite comfortable. The Russian budget presupposes an oil price of $42.40 per barrel. When it was higher, that money went into the oil or sovereign wealth fund, which, if I remember rightly, has $170 billion. The Russians have incorrectly said that they can survive with a low oil price for 5 to 10 years. I don't think at all that is true, but they can manage the balance quite well with a lower exchange rate of the ruble. The ruble that used to be 60 rubles per dollar in recent years has now fallen below 80 rubles per dollar. This means to Russians that they get less money in dollar terms. But since Russians now don't travel very much, Russia has, because of the coronavirus, effectively closed its border both for foreigners and to Russians. That is not as apparent as it used to be. So the short of it, the Russians think they can survive quite long. I don't think they can. I think that they will realize in sort of half a year's time that the decline in GDP and in standard of living is too big for their political comfort.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Tijani Nias. What could be the oil price floor in case the market is flooded with 4 million barrels a day more? Randy, that's for you.
I never make any predictions about oil price because you're always just wrong. There's plenty of room to keep going down, and I will leave it at that.
Okay, fair enough. We have an anonymous question for Anders. How will this crisis affect Ukraine's energy sector?
It is good for Ukraine. Ukraine will gain about $8 billion in less energy imports. So this will be a major positive impact. Having said that, the main second most important exports of Ukraine is steel, not least steel pipes, which are being used for oil and gas pipelines. So Ukraine gains on the import price, but they lose on the export price. So in effect, it's pretty neutral.
Okay. We have a question from Oleg Vizhunov. The fight between Saudi Arabia and Russia looks like a personal struggle between the leaders of the two states. In this situation, will oil prices fall enough, and will the U.S. offer Southeast Asian nations help to develop their own petroleum reserves, which will consolidate Washington's standing as a partner and a source of assistance? A complicated question: is the U.S. in a position to help other countries in this current oil environment? Randy.
I just don't think that in this oil environment, those plays are investable. And so it's hard to get the private sector, while they're slashing investment, to be looking at new oil developments in parts of the world that may not have the same geopolitical stability that they're looking at when they say look at U.S. shale. Now I don't know what the per barrel investment dollar would be on the for those plays out in Southeast Asia. But I don't see that as something that makes a lot of sense, at least right now, when we're talking about overall demand decline for the year being potentially between 3 and 4 million barrels. There's just not need for more oil.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Chase Winter. I've seen various estimates of how long Russia can dive into its reserves. Could you clarify how long Russia can last? Andrews, that's for you.
Yeah, if we talk about reserves, I mentioned the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is about $170 billion, and that can last for quite some time. If we take the international reserves, currency reserves of the central banks, Russia has $570 billion, which can last for a very long time. And Saudi Arabia has a bit more than $500 billion. So it's not the balance, the reserve side that is really important. It's the how much production decline that Russia will get, because with the lower oil price, the imports will be worth less that Russia gets, and that in that way it means less economic growth in Russia.
Okay, another question for you, Anders, from Hamesh Mehta. What is the likelihood of U.S. sanctions on Rosneft?
Yeah, Randy and I discussed it before this session, and my first answer was no, but then we discussed it more closely. And the US, as it is now, has so many different sanctions programs underway. So what I thought was most likely, it is tightened financial sanctions on Rosneft under the July 2014 US sanctions against Rosneft because of Russian aggression in Ukraine. What this could mean specifically is that Rosneft is now allowed 30 days of financing according to the US Treasury regulations. That can be reduced to a minimum, or Rosneft can even be excluded from financial dealings in US dollars, which would be devastating, and that could be done under current sanction program. That is quite possible. Another possibility is to sanction more of the people at the top of Rosneft. Something that has not been much noticed is that last month, when the US sanctioned Rosneft Trading SA, a Geneva-based subsidiary of Rosneft, it also sanctioned the vice president of Rosneft, who's in charge of it, who's a Portuguese Belgian citizen. That is one of the people that Sechin honors. And other vice presidents of Rosneft can also be sanctioned. So these are the two things that could be done under current sanction programs without any other decision than a decision by the Secretary of the Treasury.
Okay, the sharp drop in oil prices, does this threaten stability at all in Saudi Arabia, Kirsten?
Yes, it could, but I think we won't see protests in the streets or anything like this, because MBS will get in front of that. I mean, while all of the world is distracted by the COVID virus, we've seen reports coming out of Saudi that he has arrested the interior minister and additional royals and placed them under custody. So he is not going to leave anything to chance. And so if it looks like there would be instability, he will have the intelligence and interior services on top of it quite quickly. We're watching also whether or not, while the world is distracted by the virus, he's looking at making a play for the throne, which not in a coup, not in anything, just sort of time for transition. And if he thinks this might be a good time to make that transition, so he's aware that there are risks for instability, watching them very closely, and will do pretty much whatever it takes to make sure that the stability of Saudi Arabia and of his regime is not threatened.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Omar Shokri Kaliksar. I think it's for Randy. How will the oil market change when Iran, Libya, and Venezuela return to production in the future?
That's a really good question. I think nobody really knows what the oil market's going to look like over the next few months, and how long we'll all be on lockdown. What inevitably happens? You have these dramatic price declines, though this one is particularly anomalous, and then there will be an oil boom later on. So there is this cycle, and that those barrels have been offline for so long. As long as they're able to actually ramp their production back up, would actually be good for managing that part of the oil cycle. It's just a question of the timing at this point, and I think it's way too soon to say what oil demand is going to look like in June, even how long various countries are going to be kept on lockdown, kept prevented from driving, but also what long-term changes to consumer habits will look like based on working remotely for a month or 2 months or 3 months. Will that push for a big driving boom come summer where everybody just wants to get out of their house, or will we realize that we can get more done working remotely a few days of the week for the vast majority of white collar workers? I think those are all questions that really haven't. We're not going to know, and so it's good to know that there's that spare capacity. If we can think about it as spare capacity in the market for the next boom, but for now, I think for everyone who's still producing, they really hope that oil doesn't come back on the market anytime soon.
Okay, we have a very specific question from Roy Salom. Maybe if I mispronounced that name. It's for Kirsten, I think, and for Randy too. The fully loaded average cost of production in Saudi Arabia has risen significantly over the last few years as they have ramped up in much more expensive fields in order to expand their sustainable production to 12 million barrels or more. So is $5 a barrel a real estimate, an accurate estimate for Saudi Arabia today? Actually, maybe Randy, you want to take a shot at that and then turn it to Kirsten?
I unfortunately I only know what I can read on this. These production costs are often state secrets, et cetera. So I just don't have a good answer. Sorry, Roy, I can't help you there. And Roy,
I am not the energy expert. What we hear from Saudis, they say they can do it at 5 to 10. And what I hear from friends, people like Scott Modell, who I listen to, like the Bible, that it's more like 20 or 25. But again, I'm not the analyst on that. I could be very off. Trust the experts.
Thank you. A completely different subject for Anders. Gina Polubinskas asks, do you expect to see a drop in Russian military spending that coincides or is prompted by the drop in oil prices?
Well, this is a difficult question in several regards, because an increasing share of Russian military expenditures are now being secret. So we don't really know what to think. There is a good article by two Swedish colleagues of mine, Martin Krag is one of them, showing how we know less and less about the Russian military expenditures. Officially, the Russian military expenditures have been falling from 2016. And for example, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute takes this as bona fide. The reason would be that Russian arms procurement was huge from 2008 to 2016, or increasing fast. And then a major procurement phase was over. And procurement is a large share of the Russian military expenditure. So the answer is probably the Russian military expenditures are falling in any case. And on top of that, probably the Russians will not decrease their military expenditure for this reason. What the Russians now show is 4% of GDP in military expenditure, which is just marginally higher than the US military expenditures. But then you have a discussion that much of the security forces are under the Ministry of Interior or the FSB or other security organizations, and they should really be included in the military, while the prime purpose is to repress the own population rather than pursue military aggression against other people. So the Russian military expenditure is a very dubious concept because of what you include and what is official about them, but probably this will not influence the military expenditures.
And a follow-up, you don't think, therefore, that it will have much impact on Kremlin aggression in eastern Ukraine or the Kremlin intervention in Syria?
It will be a restraining factor, in particular that they have less money to buy foreign technology, which is anyhow because of the US technology sanctions of July 2014 on Ukraine, highly restricted. So Russia is quite careful with its military expenditures. Russia spends in ways that are harmful but do not cost. So, for example, assassination, cyber, and disinformation are very economical ways of pursuing warfare that might not be defined as warfare.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Mark David Miller. I think it's for Randy or Anders. What are the consequences of smaller producers, the consequences of these developments on smaller producers like Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan?
Yeah. Again, like any of the other smaller producers I mentioned earlier, they're going to be negatively impacted, and so they're going to have trouble making their budgets, et cetera. I think that's going to be the bigger fallout from this over the short to medium term, if there's not a resolution, is what happens to these smaller producers.
Well, yeah, Kazakhstan is in quite a serious financial crisis as it is. So when 31 central banks in the world have cut their interest rates, 2 weeks ago, the National Bank of Kazakhstan increased its interest rate by 150 basis points. And they have introduced very severe currency regulations. So Kazakhstan is in quite serious trouble as it is. And Kazakhstan now, unlike previous situations, have let their exchange rate go. And I know some exile Kazakhs who are quite wealthy here, who are in great fright, both their business in Kazakhstan and their money are literally being frozen. So the destabilizing effect in Kazakhstan should not be underestimated, and in particular because Kazakhstan has large and very sophisticated elite that has got its education abroad, not least here in the United States, and they don't like anything of what they see in the old system, and now they see that it's not working at all. So Kazakhstan, I think, is seriously destabilized. Azerbaijan is quite another matter because it's so dominated by one family, the Aliyev family. So I think that Azerbaijan can take much more tension than Kazakhstan can.
Do you think, Anders, that this will have an impact on either Azerbaijan or Kazakhstan's relationship with Russia?
Yeah, I think that this will be quite strenuous. And of course, Kazakhstan has been very dissatisfied with Russia in the Eurasian Economic Union all along. And now these tensions will become worse. There are, for example, Russia does not accept the food import from Kazakhstan. Russia does not allow Kazakhstan to export any oil or gas through state-owned pipelines in Russia. And the only pipeline system that exists that Kazakhstan can use is the Caspian pipeline going to Novorossiysk. So Kazakhstan is in a very tight spot. And Kazakhstan normally speaks softly, but it does speak so we can hear what they say.
Thank you. Kirsten, you focused on the geopolitics of this for Saudi Arabia. Do you see the Saudi position in the Middle East enhanced or weakened by this current oil fight with Moscow?
I think it's actually enhanced, to be honest. I don't think the rest of the Gulf is concerned about Saudi economically compared to what they're all going through. And I think they're waiting to see what Saudi will do in terms of OPEC, OPEC plus, or whether they will be incentivized by the discussions at the DOE about forming some sort of alternative to OPEC that still preserves Saudi's leadership, but moves toward a market-driven model for the supply side, much like the IEA is for the demand side. So, if Saudi makes that move, it puts them all in a pretty difficult position. So I think it enhances, it underscores the fact that they are a regional leader and decision driver.
Also, in the same field, is it safe to say that as a result of this current fight, the Russian prestige in the Middle East is dropping?
I wouldn't say so, to be honest, because I think the region respects that Russia puts up a good fight. So what they will be looking for is whether Russia can follow through on some of their promises to them. Russia tries to present itself as an alternative partner to the U.S. So will Russia be left with anything they can invest in militaries or training or helping to secure these countries? Probably not. And that's the value that the nations see in a potential partnership with Russia. If Russia is no longer able to do for them what they're doing for Syria, then what is the promise that Russia brings? I think that will be called into question.
Fair point.
Yeah. And this is just anecdotal, but I was on the phone last night with some colleagues in the UAE, and they said that people are blaming Russia for this mess right now. So there is at least the sense that the closeness that they were developing in the UAE with Russia may be getting.
Randy, you're
getting pushed apart.
I think you may need to repeat that.
Sorry. I was on the phone last night. This is just anecdotal, but I was on the phone last night with some colleagues in the UAE, and they suggested that the blame in the country is being placed squarely on Moscow. Now that makes sense because they're participating with the Saudis, but it is potentially driving a wedge between the UAE and Moscow, which was a relationship that was getting closer over the past few years.
Okay, we have 2 minutes left. I'll give each of you 30 seconds for a final comment. Kirsten, starting with you.
My final comment is I'd like to put on everyone's radar that they should be tracking the escalating conflict between the U.S. and Iran and Iraq right now, because we are trading kinetic activity. And if this continues to escalate, I think it's likely we could see additional disruptions in Strait of Hormuz.
Thank you. Anders.
Well, I think that this is a serious conflict. It's really a conflict between Russia, Saudi Arabia, and the US. It's an asymmetric conflict. It's not likely to be solved soon. The obvious consequence is that the oil price is likely to be very low for quite some time.
Okay, and Randy, final word.
I couldn't agree more with Anders that the oil price is going to be low for quite some time. And it's a question of how low and the question of how much storage is actually available. And we'll see more of that in the next month. One final comment on Saudi, which is that I think they learned their lesson between 2014 and 2016 that U.S. shale is here to stay, and that they can't actually fight U.S. shale and want to work with U.S. shale, and that it is U.S., but ultimately the U.S. is of course feeling the brunt of it, or at least part of the brunt of it.
Okay, thank you all very much for a wonderful conversation, and thank you for the 290 plus listeners who are with us today.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.